These things right here are valve amps. But because we're in 2023 and everything is absolutely crazy, this is also an amp. Well, in fact, it's about 6 amps in one. But does it live up to both those amps? I don't know, and that's what I want to find out. Back when I first started playing guitar, I remember my very first amp. It was the Roland Cube, and it's like 5 watts or something. It had a couple of different channels, like a clean, a crunch, and then like a metal mode or something. And then it had maybe a couple of effects too, but everything sounded pretty digital and gnarly. And then I moved up to the Marshall MG DFX 100, which again was another solid state amp. Obviously it had the Marshall name on it. And I remember at the time, I think that was like a few £100, and I saved up for ages and ages, and I think I ended up buying it secondhand. But I was always kind of longing for that elusive valve amp. If you know anything about this channel, you know that I play sort of shoegazy kind of indie stuff. So like all my favourite guitarists basically played either a JCM 800 or a Fender Twin. And whenever I listen to the records of my favourite bands, their guitar sounds always just sounded like, some of them were gnarly, but they just sounded like they were just giving you this like massive warm hug with a blanket. Yeah. Whereas with my amps at the time, everything I played just sounded a little bit thin and didn't kind of have that depth that those tube amps had. But basically, at the moment, me and my band, when we go touring, we take our amps and then we take another amp as a spare, so we have to like load all of them in. And so we were thinking maybe it was worth looking into some of the amp sims and see how they sound. And one of the ones that kept coming up was this, the Blackstar Amped-1. And I guess it is small enough to fit in a pedal board, or again, if you were using it as a backup, you could pop it on top of your amp. So when it turned up, I plugged it straight in and had a listen to how it sounded. And I was like, oh my god, this thing actually sounds ridiculously good. And it got me thinking, do you really even need a valve amp or any amp at all now when you've got these pedals? So I thought, let's do like an A/B test and see if it holds up against 2 great tube amps. Now to do this test, you can actually run this thing through a cab, but I didn't want to do that. I basically wanted to show what it was like coming direct out of this thing into an interface and then just recording that to see if the cab simulators inside it could hold up against a tube amp. Even though this thing looks super modern and futuristic, it's actually pretty simple. And I loved that because I didn't want something that was going to take me like 10 years to find a sound. So the main parameters you've got are like a gain, bass, middle, treble, and a master, just like most normal amps. But then you've got these voicings. So you've got USA, UK, and flat. And I'm assuming that the USA is a Fender and the UK is a Marshall or a Vox. I'd say probably a Marshall. And then you can basically change the power of the amp. So I guess like on a normal amp where you have attenuators that allow you to crank the gain and kind of make the amp break up easier if you lower the wattage. And then it has the response bit, which is basically loads of different tubes. And so on the Fender Twin, that has 6 L6 tubes, and then Marshalls generally have EL34 power amp tubes. And the differing tubes basically change the sound and how easy stuff breaks up. And then lastly, you've got a reverb on there. I didn't actually want to use the reverb because I wanted just how this thing sounds with the guitar going through it. And then on the side here, you've got different cab rigs. And it seemed like 1 and 3 were like different room sounds, whereas number 2 was like a close mic sound, so that's what I went with. And then I basically ran an XLR straight from the Amped-1 into our Audient ID44 audio interface. So obviously I think we should probably look at the amps that we're going to try and match the sounds of. The first is the Marshall Origin 50. It's a fairly new amp to me, and actually the cab is even newer. I just bought this Blackstar 2x12 cab and I think it sounds great. This has EL34 tubes, and it has the attenuator on it, and it allows you to kind of crank the gain at lower volumes. And then we've got the classic Fender Twin. Like I said, it's got the 6 L6 tubes in it. And I mean, does it really need any introduction? Probably like 90% of my favourite guitarists ever have used this amp. It's just a solid beast. So without sounding super cliche, I basically wanted to find the clean tone for both those amps and see if I could match it on the Blackstar and just play a few chords and kind of A/B between both the Marshall and the Blackstar and then the Fender and the Blackstar. And this is kind of what we got. Now I think you can probably see that I had to tweak the settings, and the settings weren't exactly the same on the Blackstar as they are on the amp, but I guess that's completely to be expected, and I actually think that that sounded really good, and those clean tones are just, you know, it's clean tone. What can I say? Now obviously over the years, Marshall has been synonymous with some of the greatest guitar players ever, and the reason they probably picked that amp wasn't because of its clean tone, it was because of how well those amps break up and just how good they sound when you push them. So I really wanted to see how this thing would deal with being pushed to the point of breakup, and whether it would sound kind of digital and harsh rather than like warm and saturated like the Marshall does. But I think you'll see here, this thing actually really managed it well. I think this thing really held its own there, and it didn't sound digital and like thin at all to me. I thought it sounded really warm and nice. And actually I found myself having to roll some of the bass off because it felt even kind of too thick at parts. One of the things I kept thinking when I was looking at buying one of these was, would it be able to take like really gnarly fuzz pedals? Because if you've watched any of the other videos on this channel pretty much, you'll know that I absolutely love fuzz. And it's up against possibly the greatest pedal taking amp of all time, the Fender Twin. Like the Fender Twin just is such a good pedal platform. For some reason it just takes like distortion and fuzz so well. And if ever there's a pedal to put it through its paces, it's this thing. It's the Jupiter Effects Warlow, and it's basically like a big muff with a rat. If you put it in the middle, it basically becomes a big muff and a rat. And if the Amped-1 can take this, then it can probably pretty much take anything. I feel like I probably ripped off about 10 different bands in one go with that, but that was so much fun. So now I guess it comes down to the question of whether I'd actually buy an amp if I was starting out again, or I was moving from that kind of early learning part to a tube amp. And to be honest, even now, maybe I don't actually need to lug a ridiculously heavy amp in a flight case up a bunch of stairs, play a gig, and then load it all the way down. I do think for playing live, there is definitely something about having that on-stage amp sound, especially in smaller venues, because if you're stood as an audience member anywhere near the front, you're probably getting a lot of that sound from on stage. But again, they've kind of got this covered because you can take out an 8 or a 16 ohm speaker cab, and then you have that just from this again. As an added caveat, and without trying to sound too pretentious, sometimes it's awesome just to be stood next to a cranked tube amp, and every time you stop playing, you hear feedback, and you can kind of use that feedback and use those different sounds in your guitar part. But I mean, this thing here is like £400, which is probably what, way back when, that little Marshall solid state I had was worth. Obviously the Marshall Origin 50, that's a great amp at a great price. I think they're like £500 for the head new, which is awesome, and you can kind of direct out of that as well, which is great. But I mean, for the versatility that this thing gives you, and the fact that it's only like 400 quid, to me it seems like an absolute no-brainer to go for something like this, and then maybe buy a cab if you want that too. But if you want to see the essential 5 pedals that I would get, then you can watch this video here now.